the spring of 1979, at a waterfront estate sale on the outskirts of Biloxi, Mississippi, a 38-year-old woman named Heloise Burch paid $85 for a 1961 Gulf Craft shrimp skiff that had been sitting on dry blocks behind a collapsed fish house for the better part of 8 years. The boat was finished. The hull had a crack along the starboard bow that someone had patched with roofing tar and optimism, neither of which had held. The transom was soft with rot, the kind of soft where you press your thumb in and it doesn't come back out clean. The engine, a 1958 Mercury Mark 75 outboard, was seized so completely that the service manager at the marina in Gulfport had looked at it the previous summer and told the estate lawyer not to bother listing it as a motor. Listed as a paperweight. The fuel tank had rusted through on the bottom. The bilge pump was a hand bailer made from a cut-off bleach bottle wired to a cleat. The navigation light had been a mayonnaise jar with a candle in it, and even that was gone, just the rusted wire where someone had tied it. The estate auctioneer was a man named Earl DuPont, who had been selling coastal property for 30 years and had developed a professional instinct for knowing when a crowd wanted something and when they didn't. The crowd did not want the skiff. Next item, 1961 Gulf Craft, 18 feet, inboard, outboard, soft transom, seized engine, cracked hull. Somebody give me $50 for the trailer. Nobody moved. 50? Come on, folks. The trailer alone is worth that if you need a trailer. A scrap man near the back fence raised 2 fingers. 40. 85, said Heloise. The scrap man turned around and looked at her, the way men look at women who say things that don't make sense to them. He didn't counter. 85 was more than he wanted to spend on something he'd have to haul 30 miles to get 60 back. Sold. $85 to the lady in the green truck. Her brother-in-law, Lawrence, helped her get the skiff onto the borrowed trailer. The hull scraped and groaned as it came off the blocks, the sound of fiberglass that had forgotten what it felt like to move. Lawrence stood at the stern and looked at the thing they'd just loaded, and then looked at Heloise the way people look at someone they love and can't figure out. What in the world are you going to do with this, Heloise? Fix it. With what? It needs everything. Then I'll fix everything. Lawrence secured the straps without another word. He'd married into the Burch family 17 years ago, and he had learned that when Heloise used that particular tone of voice, argument was a waste of everyone's time. By the following week, Harrison County had something new to talk about. Heloise Burch bought that old Gulf craft from the Tatum estate, the one sitting behind the fish house on Kiln Road, the one with the rotten transom and the seized-up Mercury, paid $85 for it. The story moved the way stories move in small coastal communities, from the bait shop to the fuel dock, from the fuel dock to the marine supply, from the marine supply to the back tables at Dottie's Diner on Division Street. And at every stop, the story acquired something extra, a detail, an exaggeration, a laugh, because Heloise Burch was not the kind of person Harrison County expected to be buying boats. Let me tell you about Heloise Burch. Because what she did with that Gulf craft over the next 14 months only makes sense if you understand who she was and where she came from. Heloise was born in 1941 in a house 4 blocks from the water in Pascagoula. Her father, Cyrus Burch, worked the docks his entire adult life, not fishing, not shrimping, but repairing the engines that made the fishing and shrimping possible. He ran a one-man marine repair operation out of a corrugated tin building behind the house, and he had done so since before Heloise could remember. The building smelled of diesel and salt and the particular kind of grease that never entirely comes off your hands, no matter how long you scrub. Heloise had grown up inside. That smell the way other children grow up, inside the smell of a bakery or a garden. Cyrus was not a man who explained things. He demonstrated them. When something needed fixing, he fixed it with whoever happened to be nearby, and if that person happened to be his youngest daughter, then she learned alongside him without ceremony or announcement. By the time Heloise was 12, she could pull a lower unit. By 15, she could diagnose an ignition problem by sound alone. By the time she graduated from high school, she understood marine engines the way most people understand their own handwriting. Not as a skill they'd acquired, but as something that had simply become part of how they moved through the world. She'd been accepted to nursing school in Mobile. She had the scores and the references, and a small scholarship that would have covered her first year. She had a suitcase and a plan and a departure date of September 4th, 1959. But Cyrus had a stroke that August. Mild, the doctors said. Mild enough that he was on his feet within 2 weeks, but not mild enough that he could manage the shop alone, and certainly not mild enough that Heloise could leave without knowing what she was leaving behind. She deferred the scholarship. She told herself it was temporary. Temporary, stretched into a year, and a year stretched into the kind of the time that stops being measured. She ran the shop. Not at first. At first she assisted, answered phones, handled the parts invoices. But Cyrus's right hand never fully recovered its precision, and precision is everything in marine engine work. By 1962, Heloise was doing the repairs, while Cyrus managed the customers. By 1965, Cyrus was managing the front counter from a lawn chair with a cup of coffee, and Heloise was running the operation in every way that mattered. In 1968, she married Lawrence Guidry, a quiet man who worked estimating for a construction company in Gulfport and who had the good sense to understand that he had not married a woman who needed managing. They lived in the house on Pascagoula. Cyrus had his room in the back. The shop was attached. It worked. Cyrus died in October of 1974. Peacefully, in his chair, which is how he would have wanted it if he'd thought about wanting things, which he generally hadn't. He left Heloise the house, the shop, the tools, and an account at the Merchant's Bank with $19,000 in it. That amount surprised her. Cyrus had never spoken about savings. He'd simply never spent money he didn't have to spend. And over 40 years, the money that stayed had accumulated into something real. Now the Gulf craft. When Heloise looked at that split-hulled, rotten transom, seized engine boat sitting on its trailer in the driveway on Pascagoula, she did not see what everyone else saw. Everyone else saw a boat that was done. Heloise saw a boat that was waiting. Here is what Heloise knew that Harrison County didn't. The 1961 Gulfcraft 18-footer was built on a modified V hull that the manufacturer had discontinued by 1965 because it was too expensive to produce. The hull was thick-walled fiberglass over a hand-laid mat, not the chopper gun construction that had become standard by the late 60s, where a chopper gun hull might be 3/16 of an inch. The Gulfcraft was 3/8 in the critical areas. The crack along the starboard bow was superficial. It hadn't breached the inner laminate. Heloise had gotten down on her knees in the seller's yard with a flashlight and a sharp pick, and confirmed this before the auction began. The transom was a different matter. The transom was genuinely rotten, a full replacement, not a repair. But Heloise had priced marine-grade plywood and fiberglass, cloth, and resin at the supply house in Biloxi, and the materials to build a new transom from scratch would cost her $60 and 2 weekends. And then there was the engine. 14 months before the estate sale, in March of 1978. Heloise had driven to a marine salvage yard in Moss Point to look at a pile of outboard motors that a marina had pulled from trade-ins over the previous decade. Most were past saving, but sitting under a tarp in the back corner was a 1963 Evinrude Starflight 75 that had come off a ski boat with a destroyed lower unit. The powerhead, the engine itself, was untouched. The failure had been entirely in the lower unit, the gear case, the prop shaft, the water pump. The powerhead had never overheated, never been run lean, never been abused. It had simply been attached to a lower unit that failed, which is a mechanical problem, not an engine problem. The Evinrude Starflight 75 produced 75 horsepower at the prop. The seized Mercury Mark 75 on the Tatum boat, even if it could be rebuilt, which it couldn't, not economically, produced 62 horsepower on its best day. Heloise paid $45 for the Evinrude powerhead. She brought it back to Cyrus's shop and spent 3 evenings going through it completely. New rings, new seals, a valve inspection, a thorough cleaning of the carburetors. Parts cost $51. The powerhead was ready. The lower unit she needed was a standard Evinrude 75 unit from any year between 1961 and 1967. They were already located one at a marine recycler in Mobile for $35. She hadn't bought it yet because she hadn't had a boat to put it on. That's what the auction was. The final piece of a plan she'd been assembling for over a year. The salvage man with the 2-finger bid had seen a seized Mercury and a rotten boat. Heloise had seen a hull she'd already inspected with a flashlight and a pick, attached to an engine she'd already replaced in her mind, waiting at a price that left her with money to do the work right. She started the restoration in June of 1979, after the spring charter season had passed, and the shop's workload had slowed to its summer pace. She pulled the old Mercury first and set it at the curb. A man from 3 streets over took it before noon. She didn't ask what he intended to do with it. The transom came out in sections, the saturated plywood crumbling. As she worked the pry around the edges, the pry bar around the edges. She ground the bonding surfaces clean with a 40-grit disc on the angle grinder, vacuumed the dust, and let the hull sit open in the shop for 4 days to dry completely. A wet core will ruin a new transom inside of 5 years. Heloise knew this, the way she knew everything about boats, not from reading but from watching Cyrus fix the mistakes that other people's impatience had made. She laminated the new transom from 3 layers of 3/4-inch marine plywood, each layer offset 45 degrees from the last. Epoxy between every layer. The whole assembly pressed flat under a stack of engine blocks from the shop floor overnight. The resulting panel was 2¼ inches thick and would outlast the hull around it. She tabbed the new transom into the hull with 6 layers of biaxial cloth and vinylester resin, each layer overlapping the last by 2 inches, building a bond that was structurally continuous with the original laminate. She'd seen transoms installed with polyester resin and 3 layers of matte. Those transoms rotted again inside a decade. Vinylester was more expensive and harder to work with, and worth every bit of the extra effort. The hull crack on the starboard bow, she ground out to a V-groove, confirmed the inner skin was solid, packed the groove with filled epoxy, and glassed over it with 4 layers of cloth. From 18 inches away you could see where the repair was. From 20 feet you couldn't. The bilge she cleaned down to bare fiberglass, applied 2 coats of bilge paint, and installed an actual bilge pump. A Rule 500 automatic with a float switch. wired to a proper marine circuit, with a waterproof fuse block, she'd mounted inside a small compartment she built from scrap fiberglass near the console. The console itself was an $8 find from a boat salvage in Gautier. It was the wrong color, white on a hull she'd painted Gulf blue, but it was solid and properly mounted and had working instrument holes. The Evinrude powerhead arrived from Moss Point on a Tuesday. The lower unit came from Mobile on Thursday. She mated them on Friday evening, torquing every fastener to spec with the inch-pound torque wrench Cyrus had owned since 1953. The combined Evinrude went onto the new transom, using a mounting bracket she'd fabricated from aluminum plate at the shop. The standard bracket for this engine configuration had been discontinued, and aftermarket versions cost more than she was willing to spend for something she could make in an afternoon. She drilled, tapped, and countersunk each mounting hole, applied marine sealant to every fastener, and bolted the engine to the transom with stainless hardware. She ran new fuel line from a new 6-gallon tank, mounted low and forward, well away from the engine. She installed a primer bulb in the line, a proper one, not the kind that cracked after 2 seasons in Gulf Coast heat. She wired the engine kill switch to a lanyard clip at the helm. The total parts list, start to finish: boat and trailer from estate, $85. Evinrude powerhead from Moss Point, $45. Lower unit from Mobile Recycler, $35. Engine rebuild parts, $51. Transom materials, plywood, cloth, resin, epoxy, $63. Hull repair materials, $22. Bilge pump and wiring, $38. Console from Gautier salvage, $8. Hardware, sealant, fittings, paint, $44. Miscellaneous, $19. Total, $410. 14 months of evenings and Saturdays. 1 woman, 1 inherited shop. Her father's tools and her father's way of thinking. Heloise Burch launched the Gulf craft on a Saturday morning in early September of 1980 at the public ramp on Back Bay. Lawrence backed the trailer while she walked the hull into the water. She climbed in, connected the fuel line, primed the bulb until it was firm, set the choke, and pulled the start cord. The Evinrude caught on the 3rd pull. It idled with a sound that was wrong for a Gulf craft. Too clean, too strong. The idle of an engine that had been rebuilt to 0 hours by someone who knew what 0 hours actually required. She let it warm for 5 minutes, watching for exhaust smoke, watching the water flow from the telltale, listening to the note of the idle as it settled and smoothed. She ran it out to open water past the bridge and pushed the throttle forward. An 18-foot skiff with 75 horsepower and a proper hull will move. It will get on plane inside 4 seconds and stay there without complaint. This one did. The bow came up, paused at the transition, and then the hull settled onto the step, and the boat ran flat and true across the bay. The Evinrude turning at the middle of its power band, nothing near the limit of what it could do. Heloise backed off to a cruise and let the boat run. Her neighbor to the south, a man named Gerald Tran, who ran a small charter operation out of the Biloxi small craft harbor, was coming in from a morning trip when he saw the Gulf craft running the bay. He recognized the hull before he recognized the woman at the helm. He'd grown up around Gulf crafts. He knew what they looked like and what they sounded like. He did not recognize what he was hearing. He idled alongside when she slowed near the harbor mouth. That doesn't sound like anything that should be on a Gulf craft. It's an Evinrude Starflight 75, new rebuild. Gerald looked at the boat the way people look at something that contradicts their assumptions. He'd seen the Tatum skiff on its blocks at various points over the years. He knew what it had been. You put a rebuilt Evinrude 75 on the Tatum boat. I did. How much, all in? $410. Gerald Tran ran 2 boats, a 1972 Mako that he'd paid $4,000 for, and a 1968 Boston Whaler that had cost him $3,800. He was looking at a boat that was doing everything his boats did for $410. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then your father would have appreciated this. He would have told me the console was the wrong color. Gerald laughed. It was the first time anyone along that stretch of coast had laughed about Heloise Burch and her salvage boat in a way that wasn't at her expense. Word moved differently after that. Not quickly, not the way the joke had moved. This was the way useful information moves among working watermen, carefully, specifically, confirmed by people who had seen it with their own eyes. A charter captain told another captain. That captain mentioned it at the fuel dock. The fuel dock operator mentioned it to a customer who ran shrimp boats and was always looking for ways to keep his skiffs running. By November, 2 men had come to the shop on Pascagoula to look at the boat. By January, one of them had asked Heloise if she could do the same thing to his boat, a 1964 Mako 17 with a dead powerhead and a hull that was still sound. She told him she'd think about it. She thought about it the way she thought about everything, with a yellow, legal pad, a pencil, and a clear accounting of what the work would cost versus what it was worth to charge. She called the marine recycler in Mobile and asked about powerhead availability. She checked her parts suppliers. She thought about her time, which Cyrus had taught her to value the same way he valued materials. Not cheaply, but accurately. In February, she told the man yes. His name was Philip Saunier, and his Mako sat on a trailer in his backyard with a powerhead that had thrown a rod the previous summer. Heloise sourced a rebuilt powerhead from a marine rebuilder in Pensacola, installed it in a long weekend, and had the Mako running by the first week of March. She charged Philip $175 for labor. He supplied the parts. The total cost to Philip, including the rebuilt powerhead, in die Brewerhead, came to under $600. A new factory powerhead from the dealer would have been over $1,400. A comparable used boat in running condition would have been $4,000. The second job came 2 months later, then a third, then, through the summer, 2 more. Heloise did not advertise. The work found her the way it always finds the person in a community who actually knows what they're doing. Through the failure of every other option and the recommendation of someone who had seen the result firsthand. Now, let me tell you what happened over the following decade. Because this is where the story stops being about a boat engine and becomes about something else entirely. Heloise worked the shop on Pascagoula through the early 1980s the way Cyrus had worked it, carefully, without debt, keeping the books in a green ledger that lived on the corner of the workbench. Every job documented, every part cost recorded, every labor hour logged. Not because she enjoyed the paperwork, but because the ledger told her the truth, and she had always preferred truth to comfortable fiction. She ran a low number of jobs and did each one completely right. She turned away work that would have required her to cut corners. She charged enough to make the work worthwhile, and not so much that people stopped calling. She put money in the bank with the regularity of a woman who had watched her father do the same thing for 40 years and understood what it produced. In a good year, she saved $8,000. In a slow year, 4 or 5. But she saved it before spending started, the same way Cyrus had, with the understanding that savings were not the residue of income, but the first allocation of it. By 1987, she had $67,000 in the bank. Then the savings and loan crisis came, and then The coastal development boom collapsed, and then the charter fishing industry along the Mississippi Gulf Coast hit a wall that had been built by a decade of overfishing and under-regulated commercial trawling. The men who had borrowed money to buy new boats, new equipment, new slips at the marina, those men found themselves holding payments on assets that were earning a third of what they'd projected when they signed the loan documents. Harrison County lost 6 charter operations between 1988 and 1992. Family businesses that had been on the water for 2 and 3 generations. Gone, not because the owners didn't know how to fish, because they'd built their businesses on borrowed money, and borrowed money is patient only until it isn't. Heloise's expenses didn't change. They couldn't change, because there was nothing to cut. The shop was paid for. The house was paid for. The tools were 40 years old and still working. Her biggest monthly cost was materials, and materials tracked directly to jobs, so when jobs slowed, the costs slowed with them. She watched what happened to the charter operations with something that was not satisfaction and not indifference. She had grown up around these people. She knew their families. She understood exactly how the math had gone wrong, and she knew that knowing it now was worth nothing to them. In the fall of 1990, the Delaney lease came available. A 2-acre waterfront parcel with a private dock and a small covered boat shed directly adjacent to the public ramp on Back Bay. The kind of property that let a marine service operation work without trailering boats across town. The Delaney family had operated a bait and tackle shop from the parcel for 30 years. The shop had closed in 1988 when the credit dried up and the charter traffic declined. The county set the opening bid at $60,000. It was assessed value. Assessed value in 1990 for waterfront, commercial property in Harrison County was not a number anyone with liquid money was excited about paying. $55,000, an investment group from Jackson said. $50,000, said the county assessor, adjusting the floor. At $48,000, the Jackson group raised their paddle. $55,000, Heloise said. The investment group's representative turned around. He was wearing a sport coat. He looked at a woman in a canvas work shirt and boots. He bid $60,000. $65,000, Heloise said. He went to $70,000. She went to $75,000. He conferred with his partner. They were looking for properties they could develop. $75,000 for a 2-acre commercial parcel in a depressed coastal market was at the edge of what their model allowed. $80,000, he said. He said it the way city investors say numbers when they want to signal that they have more where that came from. $90,000, Heloise said. The representative looked at his partner. His partner shook his head. $90,000, 2 acres of waterfront, a dock and a boat shed. Form of payment? The auctioneer asked. Cashier's check, Heloise said. I have it here. The crowd went quiet in a specific way. Not the quiet of people who were shocked. The quiet of people who were rearranging something. Gerald Tran was standing 20 feet away. He had come to the auction because he was thinking about bidding, and he had stopped thinking about bidding when the number reached $65,000, which was $30,000 more than he had. He watched Heloise hand a cashier's check to the auctioneer's assistant with the particular steadiness of a woman for whom this was not a gamble, but the execution of a plan she had been running in her mind for years. He found her after the paperwork was signed. $90,000, cash. That's right. Gerald took his cap off and looked at the dock and the shed and the 2 acres of Back Bay waterfront that had just changed hands in about 15 minutes. From the woman who rebuilds salvage engines. From the woman who doesn't make payments, Gerald. The difference matters. Gerald turned the cap in his hands. He'd been on the water his whole adult life. He understood tides. He understood weather. He understood how fish moved through the seasons. He was looking at something he had not understood until this moment, and was not entirely sure he would have understood even if someone had explained it to him 10 years earlier. "Your father," he said finally. He knew this was how it worked. Heloise looked at the property she'd just bought. The dock needed decking. The shed needed a roof panel replaced. She was already thinking about where the workbench would go. My father knew that a paid-for shop and a paid-for dock are the only things that can't be taken from you. Everything else is just interest payments in disguise. Heloise moved the shop operation to the Back Bay property in the spring of 1991. The work expanded to fit the space. With a proper dock, she could work on boats in the water, which meant she could take on larger vessels, inboard engines, diesels, boats that couldn't be trailered to a shop. The range of what she could do doubled, then tripled. She hired one assistant, a young man named Cody, who'd grown up around outboards and wanted to learn the rest. She paid him fairly and taught him everything. By 1995, the operation was doing more volume than Cyrus had done in the last decade of his life, with better margins, better equipment, and the kind of reputation that doesn't come from advertising. Let me tell you about what happened to the Gulf craft, because the boat matters to how this ends. Heloise ran it as a workboat for the first 5 years. She used it to reach boats moored at anchor, to carry parts across the bay, to run service calls for customers whose vessels couldn't make it to the dock. The Evinrude ran without trouble. Oil changes, spark plugs, a carburetor. Rebuild in 1984 that cost her $12 in parts and an afternoon. The hull held. The transom she'd built in 1979 was still solid in 1995, tighter than it had been the day she installed it, which was what marine epoxy and proper lamination schedule produced. In 1996, she gave the boat to Cody when she replaced it with a larger aluminum work skiff. Cody used it for another 9 years. Last anyone heard, it had been sold again and was still running somewhere in the bayou country west of Pascagoula. A boat the estate auctioneer had sold for $85 because nobody else wanted it. Still running 26 years later, on an engine that had been rebuilt in a tin-roofed shop on a workbench that smelled of diesel and salt. Heloise retired in 2004. She was 63. She handed the Back Bay operation to Cody, who had by then been with her for 13 years and knew the shop, the dock, the customers, and the ledger the way she had known them. Cody runs the operation today. He has 2 employees. One of them is his daughter. In 2006, the Harrison County Marine Trades Association invited Heloise to speak at their annual banquet. She had never spoken publicly about anything in her life and initially declined. Lawrence talked her into it. She stood at the podium with a notacard she didn't look at after the first 30 seconds. People ask me how I built a working boat for $410. That's the wrong question. The right question is why everyone else was paying $4,000 for the same capability. I didn't do anything special. I looked at what I had. I looked at what I needed. I found the most direct path between those 2 points, and I walked it. She paused. My father taught me that a tool is worth exactly as much as the problem it solves, not $1 more. If the problem costs $400 to solve, then $4,000 is not a better answer. It is a more expensive mistake. She looked out at the room. I bought 2 acres of waterfront in 1990 with a cashier's check, while the people who'd been in this business longer than me were selling their boats to make their payments. I did that because my shop cost me labor and materials, not payments. Because my boat cost me $410 and ran for 16 years. People looked at my skiff and saw a salvage project. I looked at their financing statements and saw the same thing. She stepped back from the podium. The room was quiet for a moment. And then it wasn't. Gerald Tran was in the audience. He'd sold one of his boats in 1989 to cover a loan payment. The other he'd sold in 1991. He was 64 years old and retired and listening to a woman explain in plain language what the water had taught him the hard way over 40 years. He found her in the parking lot after. $410, he said. $410, she said. I spent $8,000 on 2 boats that are both gone. You spent $400 on one that's still running somewhere. It was never about the boat, Gerald. I know. It's about the shop, the dock, owning what you use. She nodded. If you own your tools, you own your time. If you own your time, nobody else gets to decide what you do with it. Gerald looked at the bay. It was November, and the water was flat, and the lights from the harbor were laying yellow lines across it. Your father raised somebody who pays attention, he said finally. He raised somebody who knew that the distance between a pile of parts and a working boat was nothing more than knowledge and patience. The rest of it took care of itself. What do you see? Someone asked her once. When you look at a rusted engine sitting under a tarp in a salvage yard, what do you see that other people don't? Heloise thought about it for a moment. I see what failed and what didn't. The lower unit failed. The powerhead didn't. Everybody else saw a dead motor. I saw a working engine attached to a broken part. Those are not the same thing. One is worth $45. The other is worth nothing. She paused. Most people see what's wrong. They stop there. My father taught me to keep looking until I found what was right. There's always something right. Even in the worst pile of junk you've ever seen, something is right. Your job is to find it and figure out what it's worth. That's what Heloise Burch did with an $85 hull and a $45 powerhead and her father's tools in a tin-roofed shop in Pascagoula. She looked past what was broken and found what was worth saving. She built a boat that outlasted the loans on better boats. She bought waterfront property with cash while investors from Jackson stood in a crowd and tried to understand what had just happened. They said nobody wanted that skiff. Heloise wanted it. She had wanted it specifically for 14 months before she raised her hand at the auction. And when they finally saw what she did with it, not just the boat running clean across the bay, but the dock, the shed, the 2 acres paid in full, the operation she built while others were dismantling theirs. They understood what Heloise had understood from the beginning. A boat doesn't need to be new. It doesn't need to impress anyone at the fuel dock, or look right on a trailer in the driveway. It needs to work. It needs to be paid for. And it needs to be built by someone who understands that the most expensive boat in the harbor isn't the one with the highest price tag. It's the one you're still making payments on when the dock next door goes to auction. $85. A salvage powerhead. A machinist's daughter who paid attention. The boat nobody wanted. In the hands of the woman nobody understood. Until they saw what she did with it. I keep thinking about that moment at the Back Bay auction. Not the number. $90,000. But the silence after Heloise said it. The kind of silence that happens when a room full of people realizes, all at once, that they have been reading someone wrong for a very long time. That silence has something to teach, if you're willing to sit with it. What Heloise did wasn't luck. It wasn't inheritance, though her father left her something more valuable than money. He left her a way of seeing. Cyrus Burch spent 40 years looking past what was broken to find what still worked. And he did it standing at a workbench with his daughter beside him, not explaining, just doing. That's how the deepest things get passed down. Not through lectures, through presence and repetition and the slow accumulation of a certain kind of attention. I think about integrity the way Heloise lived it. Not as a word you say about yourself, but as the gap between what you claim and what you actually do, measured in ledger entries and labor hours. She didn't tell Harrison County she was competent. She rebuilt a transom to a standard no one had asked for because she knew what corners looked like after 5 years, and she wasn't willing to do that to someone else's boat or her own. That's the thing about honest work. It doesn't care whether anyone's watching. The epoxy cures the same either way. The laminate holds or it doesn't. You know what you did, and eventually the work tells the truth for you. And then there's the matter of how she thought. Heloise walked into that estate sale with 14 months of preparation behind her. She had already bought the engine. She had already inspected the hull with a flashlight and a pick. She had already priced the transom materials, the resin, the cloth, the hardware. Everyone else at that auction saw a rotten boat. She saw the conclusion of a plan she'd been running in her mind since the previous March. That's not cleverness in the way people usually mean it. Quick, effortless, born of talent. That's the kind of thinking that comes from doing the work nobody sees. The measuring and the sketching and the sourcing and the pricing, all of it before there's any certainty it will ever be needed. Most people wait until they have the thing to figure out what to do with it. Heloise figured out what to do with it first, and then acquired it at a price that reflected what everyone else failed to see. The perseverance is where I think people miss the point most completely. 14 months between buying that Evinrude powerhead and finding a hull to put it on. 11 months rebuilding the Gulfcraft in evenings and on weekends while running a shop during the day. Years of saving before there was any auction to bid on, any property to buy, any moment of public vindication. There is no version of what Heloise built that doesn't require the long, unwitnessed, unrewarded stretch in the middle. The years when the ledger is the only one who knows you're doing it right. The people who laughed about the salvage boat weren't cruel. They just couldn't see past the rotten transom to the thick-walled hull underneath. They couldn't see the engine sitting on a stand in a tin-roofed shop in Pascagoula, already rebuilt, already waiting. They saw what was in front of them and stopped there. Heloise kept looking. That's all. She kept looking until she found what was worth saving, and then she figured out what it was worth, and then she did the work to make it into what she'd already seen it could be. The distance between a pile of parts and a working boat is knowledge and patience, and the willingness to do the job right when no one is watching. That distance is the same for most things worth building.